Hey everybody, it's LavenderTowne, and over my life I've read hundreds of creepypasta because I love them, but when you get super well versed in a genre, you start to notice some repeat problems. So today I'm talking about 5 problems I often see in creepypasta, from the mildly annoying all the way up to an issue that makes them unreadable. The first and least serious problem is too much gore without setup. Now, I'm not squeamish, but if you put a little too much texture in without much connection to the characters, it can really start to lose its punch. The most effective creepypastas, for me personally, are very choosy about when they put in these types of scenes, and they make sure that you realize what horrible thing is about to happen or what the gore would mean before it actually happens. That dawning horror is really scary. A good example would be in My Friend's a Plastic Surgery Monster, where they take a great deal of time building up the scenario and the character dynamics, and really make you sit and ponder how far this person is willing to go for beauty and so-called self-improvement, so that when the character hears the sounds of bone scraping, you already have an idea of what's coming. Even in famously gory franchises like Saw, the iconic first movie spends a lot of time where the two characters are just sitting together in a room, trying to find a reasonable, non-violent solution before it sinks in for both of them and the audience that there isn't one. An overload of blood can even start to feel sort of disconnected from the body or from injuries. If it's like a shining level amount of blood, it feels more like a dream sequence, or maybe a terrible workplace mistake at a blood bank or something. Making sure that gore and blood is always connected to a threat or something scary and painful is important to making it actually feel impactful. This doesn't ruin a creepypasta for me, and if I want to read one like this on my channel, I might just tone it down a little, so it's not a deal breaker, but after reading hundreds of these, it is a little annoying or grating sometimes. The other reason I put this one first is because this is extremely subjective, like how much is too much. For some people, they like the splatterpunk genre, and gore is like half the point of the scary story for them. And for other people, things that seem relatively innocuous or not that serious could make them feel really sick. So this is definitely one of those things that are very, very subjective person to person. I think if you're a creepypasta writer or you want to write scary stories, one thing you can do to make sure you're not using gore as too much of a crutch is by toning it down or removing it and reading through your story and seeing if it still feels tense or scary. If the only thing that's making it feel tense or scary is how much blood and flesh is everywhere, then you might want to rework it and make sure that there's some other levels of tension that aren't just so literal. I think this is a really common beginner writer mistake when it comes to horror as a genre. And I do think because of that, a lot of the time when I see a creepypasta that's really front-loaded with really graphic amounts of gore, I will later find some of these other pet peeves, because usually these do get paired up with other sort of beginner writing mistakes. The next problem we're going to talk about, which is a little more serious and a little more detrimental to the story, is very often paired with this too much gore problem. So the next problem I want to talk about is what I'm calling nonsense injuries. Basically when a character is injured in a way that should be impacting them for the rest of the story, but they just kind of wrap a t-shirt around it and then act like it never happened. This is also a major problem in horror media in general, when injuries are quickly forgotten or they don't leave an impact on the character in the story. I noticed a positive example of this recently in a movie called Hush. I won't spoil it, but multiple characters in the movie get injured, and throughout the movie it actually changes what these characters are able to do. Their focus, mobility, their aim is constantly affected by the wounds that they've sustained. At one point, a character is actually having to plan around the fact that they have sustained so much blood loss and will be too dizzy to fight back or run well enough, and they have to think of a different solution because of that. I personally feel like it's a bit of a cop-out for a character in a creepypasta to sustain a concussion, major wounds to the hands or the feet, and of course major blood loss, and then still be able to run and jump and do all the physical things that they could at the start. It makes the injuries feel ungrounded to reality and like they don't really matter. This can take me out of the story, usually at a climactic moment, so it does bother me a bit, but if the story is good otherwise, this is also not a deal breaker. I also know that a lot of stories rely on adrenaline's effect on the body, which does dull pain and allow people to push through in times of great danger, so there are some circumstances where this does feel believable, but in general, I so appreciate when a story injures their character, you know, particularly in a thriller or horror situation, and then that injury actually changes what they are able to do in the future, because it makes that injury have impact, and it really makes you consider how much that has changed their life. I mean, possibly permanently. How many times have you seen in a horror movie somebody stepping on big pieces of glass? It goes like all the way up into the top of their foot bone, and then they just are able to like pull it out and run around like nothing happened. Or, you know, injuries to the legs or the shoulders, which would probably impact like their nerve endings and their muscles, and they're still able to like throw punches and jump over big hurdles. It just, I don't know, it's not just like a CinemaSins like, oh, this is not realistic, but when we're talking about horror, this is all about perceived threat and danger. And so when anything you do to diminish that feeling of threat and danger is hurting the story and the tension. Like, I really think chasing realism is not that important when it comes to storytelling. A lot of the time, it really doesn't matter if someone survives an unsurvivable wound, particularly in like a fantasy story or a drama or something like that. That never really bugs me that much. Maybe if I had like a medical background or something, it would. But I think this is one place where it really does matter. We need to know what the stakes are so that we can be afraid for our character. And so we know what's serious, what they can just walk off, and what's, you know, potentially fatal. I think that understanding threat is such a big part of creating the tension of a thriller or a horror story. And so I think in Creepypasta, it's really critical that we establish, you know, that our character is not Superman. Our character cannot withstand any wound and keep running. And I think that once you've established that, it makes every injury important. And it also means you won't have to load on as much injuries and gore, because if the injury has more impact, you don't need a higher quantity of them, if that makes sense. Next, I want to talk about Knife Guy. I think one of the biggest downfalls for me in a creepypasta is a knife guy, aka an underdeveloped human threat who is just a pale, sadistic, dark-haired guy with a scary weapon. Usually without a motive or any special traits, this character type is pretty overused. Usually they're just an imitation of the classic creepypasta guys like Jeff the Killer. Jeff the Killer already exists, so it's good in the modern era to try to make your killer a little bit more unique. I think for me, I really appreciate when a scary killer character is clearly being developed to play on the personal fears of the writer. It creates an authentic, unique version of this classic threat. And you don't have to make too many changes in order to make it feel really unique and really different from sort of this carbon copy creepypasta guy. I really think the secret to success is really tapping into what you specifically are afraid of when it comes to some kind of like home invader or serial killer. Because, you know, maybe you start with like the dark-haired emo teenager with a knife, but if you start adding new traits, branching out, like change his weapon, change his method, maybe he's a poisoner, maybe he has some sort of supernatural element, maybe he is from not America. Like, I feel like he's a very American creepypasta character. Maybe he's like actually some kind of ghost that comes from a completely different era. Like, he could be like an 80s version of this guy. I feel like even with relatively subtle changes, your knife guy could really start to sparkle. Killers not having a motive can be really interesting and extra scary because you don't know what they want, a la The Strangers. But I also think like if you give this character some kind of motivation, that also might help pull him out of the knife guy trope, just enough to like feel like they're distinct. I think that this is not a bad place to start, but you just don't want to leave it here, because again, like, we already have Jeff the Killer, we already have Tiki Toby, we have so many iconic, old school, pale, dark-haired, young knife guys, and I think that it's time to move on. It's time to add your own special spark to them, because otherwise it can feel extremely samey, and every time I encounter one of these guys in the modern age, I just find myself getting nostalgic for the old creepypastas, and it kind of takes me out of whatever story this new creepypasta is trying to tell with this like random stabby guy. Honestly, you can really tell I was a victim of this trope as well, because this looks exactly like my OC Cole from my webcomic from when I was 15, but, you know, with a knife, like an evil version of Cole. Like, trust me, I too have been a victim of the dark-haired emo teenage boy craze, but, like, I just think that, you know, you wanna add a little to it just so it doesn't feel so samey. This next trope can even mess up a really well-written creepypasta, and we're finally getting into the area where it starts to get so serious it might ruin the whole story for me, and this is the failure to surprise. Some creepypastas are well written, but lack one of my favorite things about the horror genre. If it is clear what is going to happen right from the start, it takes a lot of the impact away. It's not impossible to write an effective scary story where there isn't a twist or any surprise, but it is much harder. As a reader, you get more uneasy if you can't predict the direction things are going, because you can't prepare for it. If you were the character, any scary thing would scare you because it's your actual life that's in danger, but as a reader, that unsafe feeling often comes from a lack of knowledge or foresight. It doesn't have to be an elaborate Shyamalan-style twist, but if the story starts with someone being chased by a killer and then they're just killed, it's a little too straightforward. If a story starts with a house that seems to be haunted and everyone says it's haunted and then it's haunted, it's a little boring. Like, it's not like the idea that ends up being the truth can't be floated early in the story, but there has to be some other possibilities, some other explanations, in order for it to really feel like earned and interesting by the end, just in my opinion. I know this is not a factor for everybody, and it is more of a taste thing, but I find it's almost like with comedy, where a lot of comedy comes from a sense of like a setup and then a surprising answer. I feel very much the same way with horror and mystery. Like, if you read a detective novel where you knew exactly who the killer was right away and there's nothing to uncover, that could be quite boring. When I was looking for my most recent creepypasta, which I actually just read last week, I did read some comments on the creepypasta fandom board under some other stories, and one person's comment really stood out to me as something that is kind of critical, and they were just basically saying, you know, the only possibility that was introduced to us about what could be going on ended up being the truth, so it doesn't really feel like there's any suspense there. There was never a point at which the character didn't kind of know what was going on, and then that was confirmed at the end, and then the story was over. I do think that can really make a whole story feel really deflated, even if otherwise it's written really well. And I think that it can be, you know, easy to do this, to fix it, just by trying to put yourself in your character's shoes and making sure that, like, even though you have all the information as the author, remembering that they don't have that information and they're not going to jump to that conclusion because usually it's something completely insane, like a werewolf or a ghost. Even with like a home invader or a stalker or a serial killer, this is something that you are so unlikely to actually have to encounter that usually people aren't going to think of it right away. So that's something that can really help avoid this and make it feel a little more textured and realistic, rather than the character just going, I'm pretty sure that's a ghost, and then it's a ghost. This last one is the most serious because it is the most likely to cause me to just stop reading immediately and not even consider reading it on my channel, and that is no editing and no research. Now first, I want to do a big disclaimer, and this is true for everything I talked about in this video. Creepypastas are stories that people are writing and giving away completely for free, so I never want to be as hard on them as I would be on like a professional work where there's a certain standard that is kind of expected. However, I do think that, like, even just a very basic edit, just like spell check and like just like reading it out loud once to like eliminate times when, like you said, and twice, or, you know, stumbling blocks in your story. All you have to do is read it out loud one time and you're likely to kind of find the most egregious mistakes and be able to fix them before you publish them online. And I think that, like, you know, I don't expect creepypastas either to have the level of research. Like, for books, sometimes people travel to different countries and like read huge tomes from different time periods to research their novel. I would never expect that from somebody who's doing this for fun. However, I do think like a quick Wikipedia skim about the thing that you're basing your story on can also really help and make it more fun and exciting for you as the writer, because you are armed with more options. Like, if you're writing a story about like something medical, some kind of medical condition or science or something like that, you know, you don't have to like go super deep into the archives of some sort of academic library, but just like reading a little bit online just to get like a baseline knowledge, if that's going to be a big part of your story, I think could make a lot of creepypastas go from super mediocre to like actually pretty awesome and maybe like pasta of the month category level, you know. I know creepypastas as a genre kind of get made fun of and not taken seriously as like silly amateur writing that isn't worth reading. I honestly really like and respect this genre. I think that it's so fun. Like where a lot of people I think got into fan fiction, I got into creepypasta, and I think that there's some out there that are legitimately amazing and could kickstart someone's actual writing career. So I think it's worth talking about the things that make creepypastas better or potentially worse. And I think that the genre honestly deserves a little bit more respect because there's some really great stuff in there, and I think, you know, I just love this part of the internet where people are like being creative and sharing stuff just for the joy and the fun of it. So ultimately, I want to end this video by saying that even if a creepypasta you've written had every one of these problems, I still want to thank you for writing it. I think that this is such a cool little niche on the internet, and I hope that people keep writing scary stories online. I just released a creepypasta last week, so definitely check it out if you haven't seen it. And thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much to my patrons and members, including Pale Star, Darkholder, Frog Scourge, Zucchini, Zio Rays, The Main PC, Esther Kaufman, Sopapia, Roger Baker, Pretty Little Head Poppy Seed, Hey Chol, Neko Omori, Trexa Panda, Lucians, Lonely Zealot, Novel Goblin, The Mousy Mouse, Clown of Clubs, Prince Piplup III, I'm a Potato, Honey Kitten, Loro, Data, Lily McFarlane, Skitten, Gold Pikachu. The Names Are Gone, Crodotus, Rectangle, Blanket of Misery, Moves Like Platinum, Sunday Good Enough, Ace Warner, Jordan, Clown of Clubs, Jeffu, Sunshine, River the Goblin, Raz Tarosh, Casey, Graveyard Moss, Grexius, Emma Lightning, The Midwestern Menace, CB, Lucy Yamajiki, Ravenscrow, Zocelot, Jabber Dabber Doo, Light Julie, Kadaria, The Expressive Poker Face, Tsubaki, Cutie Pie, Ice Cream Pal, Cola, JJ Jade, and of course, Blah 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 Blah.